I suppose I make art because I've always had, I've always been drawn to curiosity and looking at the world and how we perceive things and how it's different to other people. It might sound like a pretty obvious question, but it's something that I've always been intrigued by, those questions: who we are, how we're perceived, how we perceive others. Why do I think differently one minute and then think differently the next? Why does the other person think differently? And you have an agreement on something and then it changes. And I think maybe it was because I grew up in a mixed family background with both, I suppose, Scottish and Aboriginal. And I mean, when I was growing up, it wasn't so different, of course, you know, but when I was getting older, you kind of notice how people had different perceptions about things, about identity or political issues, kind of quite fundamental issues. And I grew up in a very strong women family too. And being a man and growing up in the western suburbs of Sydney, I mean, it was pretty kind of man-oriented and football and stuff. So, I mean, I don't know, there's kind of lots of different things. And just being as a child, I just remember thinking differently, like most of us as creative people or other people. I don't know, it was just kind of a different way of thinking. And that was, you know, the arts felt like a kind of a pretty malleable place. I just fell into it. And I think the freedom of it as well. Yeah, I can kind of make art out of, you know, plastic sculpture or photography, or, and you know, I've been making art a lot more different mediums in the last 5 or so years, but I'm definitely drawn more to the larger scope of ideas around difference. I mean, I think the more that I've researched particular themes in my work around memory and what's invisible and what's not in regards to history and identity in Australia, but also internationally, and how certain people are remembered or not remembered, or particular histories are remembered in certain ways, it's always drawn me to what is truth. And that's kind of a tricky question because it's such a construct. But the War Memorial Jumping Castle was, I suppose, something that I wanted to make for an international perspective on those cultures or people, really, generally. It's about humanity, who are forgotten, who don't have memorials, who don't have plaques, who basically aren't the so-called winners. And I'm quite moved by that. And I suppose I'm curious why, for example, Australian and other societies like Australia are kind of almost fearful of rejoicing people who are forgotten. And I think that internationally, you know, there are some really fantastic examples that, I mean, it's a tough path to walk. But these are the kind of things that I'm interested in. Of course, that ties in with circuses and theme parks and the freak show, and how Indigenous and other people were taken away, or people who were differently abled and they were taken away, you know, or kind of wanted to fit into a circus kind of atmosphere. It's got lots of different ideas rolled into the War Memorial Jumping Castle, but also the way in which it's not fixed. So, you know, the War Memorial can pop up and then, you know, it can disappear again. And this is really a big irony, and I try to keep a lot of humour in my work as well, because I think that sometimes issues are tough and we need a bit of humour to deal with them. And there are generational differences. Certain people think, you know, things should be left in the closet, you know, skeletons in the closet. People should, you know, think that no, they should be dealt with. But that, all of those kind of ideas, also mixing with human remains being removed to go overseas, also contemporary issues on asylum seekers and how particularly first world nations generally deal with the idea of asylum seekers coming. Australia has got a terrible track record in regards to the media and how Australians do not embrace the kind of different histories that these people have. And that all of these kind of things come together for me, really, from the War Memorial Jumping Castle into the cell. And the cell, I mean, obviously it's about incarceration, but it's also about the body. And for me, the cell was really about creating an autonomous space that was not the institute, that was not a familiar place where people could don a costume and they could become invisible. And in the original drawings, I had the costume covered the face as well, and we explored kind of a one-way gauze with the pattern going over it. So it wasn't gender specific, it wasn't colour skin specific, it was, you were completely covered, hands, everything. And, that for budget restraints, we couldn't afford to do that, but that was the original idea. So the cell really is a space that takes it one step further from the War Memorial Jumping Castle that, of course, had ethical implications too. Did you want to jump on a war memorial or not? And at first, people could jump on the war memorial, but it was slowly being damaged, and that's the reason why I stopped it from being jumped on. But in hindsight, I think I should have allowed it to be damaged and destroyed. So when it showed again, it's this damaged work that's kind of trying to lift up, but it can't lift up. And I think that would have been the perfect outcome. And it may happen in the future. But with the cell, it was very much about people, kind of donning a costume, going in and being in a space that challenged even myself. Like I had ideas about what the cell would do, but generally, I think it's very much up to the individual experience. Some people don't want to go in for whatever reason. Other people go and have a great time and get exhausted. Some people get in and do have a think about what that experience is. So I think that the cell is definitely an almost kind of neutral space, even though it's not neutral. It's highly kind of optical and. But I think it's about breaking down boundaries. Well, that's what I kind of really wanted it to be about. Yeah, the pattern of the cell and the jumping castle and other works which I've made being influenced by the pattern is a traditional pattern that is from Wiradjuri, from Western New South Wales, but also other Aboriginal nations use it as well. And it's found on dendroglyphs, which are tree carvings, that mark burial sites and also ceremonial grounds, and also on shields. And it's such a strong motif, but for me, it's representative of kind of it's kind of like Neo's Matrix, and I like that because it's about how we see. We all see differently, and if it could be a colour, like I might see in blue, and someone else might see in pink or mauve, or sometimes blue, so it's this kind of. I use the pattern in a way in which really we see, and that's the way I see, and. And that's like with a set of, ideas about something. It's how we judge. It's how we perceive things. So, but it's also highly optical as well. And it was used in the cell and in the costumes as like a camouflage, I suppose, where it does dominate the space. And that's something that it's something that has its own kind of life in a way. Like even though I've kind of created the pattern, it's not so important that people get it straight away. It is kind of like a camouflage. So I think that when I make work, I don't feel like I own it at the end of the day. It kind of goes off and does its own thing, and I change, and it changes, and people interact with it. So, but its tradition is very strong. Mm.